So I just got my financial advisor on the phone, told him I'm a little overextended. 4 credit cards, building a guest house I can't afford, the roof is leaking, my side hustle stopped paying. And he says, "Okay, here's the plan, sell the front yard." I said, "Sell the front yard? That's the nicest part of the property." He says, "Right, that's why someone will buy it." And then I realized I wasn't talking to my financial advisor. I was reading the IMF's notes on Egypt. 2 years ago, Egypt sold a 40,000-acre stretch of Mediterranean coastline to the UAE for $35 billion. And that was the good news of 2024. Today, we're breaking down how the economy of one of the most strategically important countries on Earth ended up here, and where it's heading next. Let's get into it.
The year is 2024. You're standing on a windswept stretch of pristine Mediterranean coastline called Ras El-Hekma, about 350 kilometers northwest of Cairo. Olive groves to your left, turquoise water to your right. 40,000 acres of some of the most beautiful undeveloped land in the entire Mediterranean basin. And your government just sold it. Not leased, not licensed, sold to Abu Dhabi for $35 billion. It is, as Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouly proudly announced on television, the largest foreign direct investment in an urban development project in Egypt's modern history. It's also, depending on who you ask, either a brilliant economic rescue mission or the moment your country quietly sold off a piece of itself to keep the lights on. Because here's the thing about Egypt in 2024, the lights, frankly, were flickering. The Egyptian pound had just been devalued by roughly 40% in a single morning. Inflation had peaked above 41% the year before. Foreign debt had quadrupled under President Abdel Fattah el-Sisi to $165 billion. The country owed nearly $35 billion in external debt servicing in that calendar year alone, an amount almost identical to its total foreign currency reserves. And just to add insult to injury, Houthi rebels in Yemen had decided to start firing missiles at container ships in the Red Sea, slashing Suez Canal revenue, one of Egypt's biggest sources of dollars, by somewhere between 50 and 70%. So when the United Arab Emirates showed up with a check for $35 billion to buy a coastal peninsula, the Egyptian government did what any cash-strapped country with a 110 million person population, a crumbling currency, and a $58 billion vanity project capital city in the desert would do. They took the deal, and then they immediately devalued the currency again. Welcome to one of the most fascinating, contradictory and quietly tragic economies in the world. A country that controls the most strategic shipping choke point on the planet, but can't reliably keep its own electricity grid running. A country whose government spends 65% of its annual budget on debt payments, while building a new capital city with the tallest tower in Africa. A country where remittances from Egyptians who left to work abroad, $41.5 billion in 2025 alone, now bring in more dollars than the Suez Canal, tourism, or any export sector. Which, if you squint, means Egypt's most successful export is its own people. In this video, we're going to break down exactly how Egypt got here. We'll cover 10 distinct dimensions of this economy: the pound's spectacular collapse, the IMF's revolving door of bailouts, the Suez Canal's revenue cliff, the military's quiet takeover of the private sector, the mega-project obsession, the demographic time bomb, the bread subsidy that's literally too important to fail, the gas crisis nobody saw coming, the diaspora economy keeping the whole thing afloat, and finally, the $35 billion question, whether any of this is actually working. Before we get started, if you enjoy deep economic breakdowns of countries most channels won't touch, hit subscribe. We do this every week. Like the video, drop a country in the comments you want us to cover next, and let's get into it. 1. The pound that couldn't stand, a currency in permanent free fall.
Imagine it's 2015. You live in Cairo, you're working a middle-class job, and you're saving for an apartment. At any bank, you can trade 7 Egyptian pounds for $1. Life has its usual hurdles, but the value of your labor feels predictable. Today, that same dollar costs 50 pounds. If your salary hasn't changed, you are now earning a fraction of what you were a decade ago in real terms. That apartment you wanted now costs 7 times more in pounds, while your income might have only doubled. When a currency loses 85% of its value against the dollar in under a decade, 40 years of family savings can be reduced to the cost of a single vacation in Sharm el-Sheikh. This total collapse was a deliberate economic strategy. In order to keep the national financial system from failing entirely, the central bank chose to let the pound's value fall to its actual market price. This creates a difficult question. How did a plan to save the national economy require devaluing the life savings of millions of people? For years, the Central Bank of Egypt maintained a pegged exchange rate. They set an official price for the pound that was significantly higher than what it was actually worth on the open market. It's like a shopkeeper insisting a stale loaf of bread costs the same as a fresh one. You can put whatever price you want on the tag, but eventually customers will stop buying the stale bread at that price, and a black market for fresh bread will emerge next door. Lacking dollars at the official rate, importers bought them on the black market at a premium. These expensive dollars drove up inflation, worsening the official rate's disconnect. This created a doom loop where protecting the pound made it more unstable. Refusing to admit what a currency is actually worth eventually forces an economy into this kind of self-destructing cycle. Egypt has broken this cycle 4 times since 2016. The first devaluation was a condition for a $12 billion bailout from the International Monetary Fund, causing the pound to drop from around 9 to 18 per dollar overnight. The second crash arrived in March 2022. Following the invasion of Ukraine, foreign investors pulled $20 billion out of Egyptian debt in a matter of weeks, causing the currency to slide again. After a late 2022 draw of 24, economists argue this was necessary. Holding the currency artificially high kills exports and drains foreign reserves, as the central bank burns dollars defending an impossible price. There were immediate benefits to the 2024 devaluation. With the black market eliminated, money sent home by Egyptians abroad surged 83%, and tourism revenues hit record highs. By the logic of the national ledger, the treatment worked. The country's balance sheet was stabilized. That most people don't live in the world of macroeconomics. A structural adjustment is experienced by citizens as the sudden loss of the market value of their savings. This grid represents the Egyptian population. Even before the most recent crash, the national poverty rate was already at 33.5%. The inflation that followed the 2024 devaluation pushed an additional 5% of the population below the poverty line. These apartment buildings in Cairo are now out of reach for many who were once considered middle class. The doom loop ended, and the currency is priced correctly, but the people who saved for years have been priced out of their original goals. The citizens whose savings lost value weren't the ones who mismanaged the central bank's reserves or created the artificial peg in the first place. It shows a difficult truth about national debt. When a government refuses to value its currency correctly, the cost of fixing that math is eventually paid by the citizen.
2. The IMF's frequent flyer program, 4 bailouts and counting.
You know that friend who keeps coming back to ask for just one more loan? The one who swears they have a plan this time? On the international financial stage, that friend is Egypt, and the reluctant lender writing the checks is the International Monetary Fund. Since 2016, Egypt has signed 4 separate IMF programs. The IMF exists to be a lender of last resort, the macroeconomic equivalent of dialing 911. Yet they have been on speed dial in Cairo for nearly a decade. The dependency has deepened with every deal. In 2016, Egypt secured a $12 billion facility. By 2020, pandemic shocks required $5.2 billion. Late 2022 brought $3 billion after massive capital flight. In March 2024, that program upgraded to a staggering $8 billion. Egypt is now the IMF's second largest borrower in the entire world. The only country ahead of them is Argentina, a nation whose relationship with the IMF is so notoriously dysfunctional, it practically became a meme. Egypt has effectively reorganized its economy to survive on permanent international life support. To be fair to the IMF, their standard medicine for a balance of payments crisis is based on decades of economic evidence. The conditions they attached to Egypt's loans were harsh: float the currency to find its true market value, cut deeply into fuel and electricity subsidies, and raise interest rates. On paper, this strategy actually appears to be working. This chart tracks Egypt's headline inflation, showing a dramatic recovery. The annual rate dropped from over 35% in early 2024 down to roughly 11.9% by January 2026. Simultaneously, real GDP growth hit a multi-year high of 5.3%. Looked at strictly through these official, high-level metrics, the Egyptian bailouts look like a complete success story. Beneath those impressive headline figures, the domestic government is financially bleeding out. The state budget is collapsing under the weight of the loans that produced those good numbers. This pie chart illustrates the government's expected tax revenue. A staggering 91% goes strictly to paying interest on accumulated debt. The budget is effectively a debt servicing operation. Every remaining dollar for schools, infrastructure, and health is fought over in the tiny margins. Egypt's total external debt has roughly tripled since 2015, but only half of that appears in the official annual budget. The rest is hidden off-budget, taken on by state economic bodies and the central bank, often through short-term foreign deposits from Gulf allies. The government has masked a massive shadow borrowing scheme behind the illusion of IMF compliance. Economists categorize this behavior as reform fatigue. The government treats the IMF conditions like a short-term hurdle. They implement enough painful policy change to access the next tranche of cash, then quietly slow roll or abandon the rest of the plan until the next crisis hits. The most glaring abandoned reform is the effort to reduce the military's role in the economy. State-owned and military enterprises continue to avoid privatization, dominating domestic industry while running enormous deficits, like the Egyptian General Petroleum Corporation, which alone runs deficits of up to $4 billion a year. The cost of stalling these structural reforms is immense. Over the last decade, investor panic has triggered 3 separate waves of capital flight, draining more than $40 billion out of the economy and repeatedly crashing their foreign currency reserves. The meter is ticking upward once again. In 2026, the IMF revised Egypt's growth forecast downward, citing regional conflict and higher energy prices. The structural weaknesses remain, making a 5th bailout probable. Until Egypt fixes the underlying engine that actually generates foreign currency, the country remains caught in this cycle of debt.
3. The Suez Canal, a 156-year-old ATM that suddenly stopped working.
Put yourself on the bridge of a massive cargo ship in 2023. You are hauling 18,000 containers of consumer electronics from Shanghai, and you need to get them to Rotterdam. You have 2 options. Option A is the Suez Canal, a 193-kilometer trench through the Egyptian desert that keeps your journey to 11,000 nautical miles. Option B requires sailing entirely around the continent of Africa via the Cape of Good Hope, dragging the trip out to roughly 14,000 nautical miles. Taking the long way adds 10 days to your voyage. It also forces you to burn well over an extra $1 million in fuel and crew costs. Faced with those numbers, captains naturally chose the shortcut. That single desert channel routinely handled 12% of all global maritime trade. In the 2022 fiscal year alone, it generated a record $9.4 billion in transit fees for Egypt. For over a century and a half, the canal operated as an infallible, permanent economic engine. It was the geological equivalent of owning a toll booth on the only road into town, effectively serving as an ATM for the Egyptian government. Then, on November 19, 2023, Houthi militants hijacked a car carrier called the Galaxy Leader. Within weeks, the Red Sea became an active conflict zone. The Yemeni fighters began systematically firing missiles and drones at commercial vessels, specifically targeting ships they deemed linked to Israel, the US, or the UK. By January 2024, the world's largest shipping companies, industry giants like Maersk and MSC, had completely abandoned the Red Sea route. They pulled their fleets back and pivoted to the safety of Option B. A local militia broke a 156-year-old pillar of international trade. Suddenly, that expensive month-long detour around Africa became the only viable path forward. This line graph mapping Suez Canal container traffic reveals the carnage. Traffic flatlined in 2024, dropping 90% as ships routed away. Looking at quarterly revenue on the same timeline, the toll booth's income collapsed. By the second quarter, revenue fell from $2.54 billion to $870 million. According to international bodies and Egyptian officials, the cumulative financial damage of that lost traffic reached roughly $6 to $7 billion in lost receipts. Egypt was already struggling with a severe chronic dollar shortage and a crushing $165 billion in foreign debt. Losing half of its most reliable foreign income stream overnight transformed a fiscal headache into a catastrophic systemic threat to the nation's solvency. The severity of this collapse traces back to a massive political bet placed in 2015. The government launched an $8 billion new Suez Canal expansion project. To fund it, they bypassed international lenders and issued special bonds directly to Egyptian citizens, pitching the investment as a patriotic duty. This bar chart outlines the project's core promise. The expansion was supposed to double annual revenue to $13.2 billion by 2023. Instead, it peaked at $9.4 billion, and post-crisis, that actual figure was cut nearly in half. Optimists argued this was just a temporary disruption. They pointed out that after an October 2025 ceasefire stabilized the region, container traffic tentatively began to return to the Red Sea. But widening a canal means nothing if your core customers adjust their supply chains to avoid you entirely. Global shipping networks do not idle their operations and wait out conflicts. They actively re-engineer their entire logistics models to survive them. This area chart shows how carriers absorbed those long Cape voyages. They deployed their backlog of newly built ships directly onto the route, permanently expanding the Asia-Europe capacity share from 21% to nearly 25% of the global fleet. Even with the ceasefire holding, the damage persisted. Freight rates between Shanghai and Rotterdam remained 80% higher than pre-conflict levels through the entirety of 2025. The industry successfully built a new economic logic around the African detour. Once carriers invest billions to optimize a longer path, the original shortcut loses its absolute leverage. The 2-year revenue gap is a fixable problem, but the loss of an absolute monopoly over east-west logistics represents a structural change that the global shipping industry has already learned to navigate. The truth is, the canal's long-term trajectory was already facing serious headwinds. Supply chains are nearshoring, automation is changing manufacturing hubs, and electric vehicles are slowly displacing the massive oil tankers that pay top dollar for transit. Despite its outsized importance to Egypt's foreign reserves, the canal directly contributes roughly 2% of the country's overall GDP. Yet, the sudden loss of that specific cash flow pushed the government to the brink, forcing a desperate $35 billion sale of a coastal peninsula just to avoid defaulting on national debt. This discrepancy reveals a hidden architecture. If the canal only accounts for 2% of GDP, the country's true survival depends on the sectors that manage the recent $35 billion land deal and the massive construction projects currently dominating the landscape. Those sectors are the domain of the military. From vast real estate developments to food production and construction, the armed forces have built a shadow economy that owns the vast majority of the nation's wealth, making them the only power capable of surviving the canal's collapse.
So far, we've talked about what happens to Egypt. The currency, the IMF, the Houthis at the canal. Bad luck, bad timing, bad geography. Now we flip the script. Because the next part isn't about what the world did to Egypt's economy. It's about what Egypt did to it. Stay with me.
4. The generals are in the cement business, Egypt's military economy.
Inside an Egyptian factory, soldiers in full tactical gear work the assembly line, packing boxes of dry pasta. This is a standard feature of the Egyptian economy. Here, the military competes directly with private businesses for market dominance and supermarket shelf space. The military's corporate reach extends far beyond defense. Generals serve as the executives for the country's largest cement plants, steel mills, beach resorts, and massive agricultural firms. Because these commercial activities are exempt from civilian audits and public disclosure, the true size of this empire is a matter of speculation. Estimates of the military's share of national GDP range from a conservative 2% to as high as 40%. This makes the military a dominant, unaccountable force. It is not a side venture for the officer corps. It is the most consequential and least understood feature of the entire national economy. The government's defense of this system rests on Egypt's bureaucratic struggles. The civilian state has a reputation for being slow and corrupt, with infrastructure projects that can take decades to complete. The military offers a different model. It utilizes its own engineering corps, its labor force is legally barred from striking, and it has a track record of executing massive infrastructure projects at scale. A key player in this model is Mustaqbal Mis, or Future of Egypt. By presidential decree, this military-run powerhouse has rapidly taken control of nearly 1 million acres of state-owned agricultural land. While the military is effective at mobilizing resources, this operational success creates a structural imbalance that prevents any fair competition with the private sector. The dominance of military-run firms is the result of a specific set of structural advantages that no private business can match. Comparing civilian versus military operating costs. Military firms pay zero corporate tax and receive state land below market price. They receive no-bid government contracts and use conscripted soldiers serving mandatory service, providing free labor. This crowding out systematically displaces and destroys private investment. In this environment, private businesses do not just struggle to compete, they are often permanently erased from the market. These conditions have drawn the attention of the International Monetary Fund. As part of a multi-billion-dollar bailout, the IMF has attempted to force the creation of a fairer marketplace. The IMF's primary demand is for Egypt to sell off its military-owned enterprises. On paper, the Egyptian government has repeatedly agreed to do exactly that. The reality on the ground is different. Even as officials promise reform to international lenders, new decrees have continued to grant the military more land and expanded commercial privileges. There is also a technical barrier. The military economy is a financial black box. It remains exempt from standard tax accounting and civilian audits. It is impossible to sell off an empire when no one, possibly including the government itself, knows what these companies are actually worth. This resistance to reform is rooted in political survival. President Sisi's rise to power and the stability of his administration depend entirely on the support of the military. By embedding the officer corps in these lucrative commercial ventures, the regime ensures that the military's personal wealth is directly tied to the survival of the government. From a political perspective, asking the military to give up its business empire is the same as asking the regime to dismantle its own foundation. The regime continues to prioritize the loyalty of its generals over national economic growth, even as it pours resources into massive construction projects in the desert. Drop a comment below and tell us which country's economy we should explain next.
5. The $58 billion city in the desert, Egypt's new administrative capital.
Cairo is suffocating. Somewhere around 22 million people are stuffed into a metro area, running on infrastructure that was never designed to handle them. Traffic is entirely gridlocked, and the pollution is a daily physical weight. But if you drive 45 kilometers east, past the fading suburbs and the roadside cafes, you leave the smog behind. You hit open scrubland. And then, rising straight out of the sand, you hit a metropolis. Why does a country with a historic, densely populated capital crumbling under its own weight decide to build a massive, empty sci-fi city in the middle of nowhere? This is the new administrative capital. The estimated price tag is $58 billion. To legitimize the cost, the government mandated record-breaking structures: the Middle East's largest cathedral, Africa's largest mosque, and the 70-story iconic tower. The official rationale makes a certain amount of sense on paper. Cairo's congestion is a massive drag on economic productivity. Building a purpose-designed administrative hub to relieve urban density is a standard governance tactic. Kazakhstan did it, Brazil did it, but those cities actually have people in them. This project was promised as a 5-year build. We are now in year 11. Right now, its wide 8-lane boulevards are populated by roughly 1,500 families and a few thousand construction workers looking out over half-finished dirt lots. This empty $58 billion project functions as a deserted VIP club, isolated from the very population it was meant to house. To understand why the city is empty, we have to look at the cost of entry. A basic 2-bedroom apartment in the new capital starts at around $50,000. This chart compares that asking price against the reality of the Egyptian economy. On the left is our towering $50,000 apartment cost. On the right, this tiny sliver is the country's average GDP per capita, less than $3,000 a year. For a completely average citizen to afford the cheapest unit fare, they would need to save 100% of their income for 17 straight years. They would have to pay exactly $0 for food, rent, transport, or taxes for nearly 2 decades. And that generous hypothetical doesn't account for the roughly 35 million Egyptians currently living entirely below the poverty line. So mathematically, the exact 22 million people causing Cairo's overcrowding crisis are priced entirely out of the city built to solve it. If the target demographic isn't the Egyptian public, we need to look at who actually owns the city. The entire megaproject is run by a single corporate entity called ACUD. Looking at this pie chart of ACUD's ownership, you might expect a civilian housing authority to hold the reins. The Ministry of Housing holds a 49% stake, but the 51% majority belongs directly to the Ministry of Defense. This means the entity selling high-end real estate is legally a military operation. They don't pay corporate taxes, and their financial books are shielded from any civilian oversight or government audit. You might wonder how a tax-exempt military project gets funded when Egypt's currency has lost 85% of its value. The state has been issuing massive amounts of debt. It got so bad that Egypt had to take an IMF bailout, which came with a strict condition: stop building megaprojects. The Egyptian government agreed to that pause in writing. A few months later, President Sisi officially inaugurated the new capital anyway. Economists refer to this as a project-driven economy. The goal isn't to stimulate civilian businesses or improve living standards. The goal is to launch massive, unauditable contracts that keep the country's military and political elites heavily compensated. The new administrative capital is a military-run real estate bubble in the desert, kept afloat by international debt. Keep in mind, the United Nations classifies roughly 70% of Egyptian cities as having low development potential. Millions live in informal settlements, lacking reliable electricity, clean water, and basic sanitation. If you took $58 billion and invested it into those existing grids, fixing plumbing, paving roads, upgrading power lines, the return on investment for the national GDP would be massive. But a functioning sewer system doesn't give a politician a grand ribbon to cut. A sleeked new monorail does. The state is deliberately prioritizing the aesthetics of progress over the measurable survival of its own population. The 45-kilometer gap between Cairo and the new city functions as a strategic moat, separating the government from the city it serves. By moving the presidency and the government ministries deep into the desert, the regime is distancing itself from Tahrir Square. This is the geographic center of Cairo and the historic epicenter of civilian revolutions that have toppled Egyptian leaders. You can't stage a mass uprising against a heavily militarized compound 45 kilometers away in the scorching sand. Relocating the command structure physically neutralizes the threat of a civilian revolt. The government successfully financed a $58 billion escape pod. The only problem is, they still have a nation of 110 million increasingly frustrated people left back on the ground.
6. The bread subsidy, the most politically important loaf in the world.
In Egypt, there is a specific word for bread. It's aish. It shares the exact same linguistic root as the Arabic word for life. When you buy bread here, you are quite literally buying life. And for a very long time, it has cost about 1/10 of a single US cent. This is baladi bread. It is a small, round, flat loaf that serves as the daily caloric foundation for the vast majority of the country. Through a sprawling government ration card system, somewhere north of 77 million eligible Egyptians secure their daily allocation of these loaves. Here is the micromath. Producing one loaf costs 1.25 Egyptian pounds, but the official subsidized price is exactly 5 piastres. The government simply eats the difference. Multiply that steep loss across 77 million daily dependents. The cumulative daily deficit is staggering. This daily multi-billion-pound tab is the price of political survival. It is an incredibly expensive form of regime insurance, paid out every morning simply to keep the country functioning. To understand the stakes of this math, we have to look at what happened the last time a leader tried to balance the books. In January 1977, President Anwar Sadat attempted to reduce subsidies on basic goods. Within hours, riots broke out across every major city. 48 hours of chaos left at least 79 people dead and government buildings in ashes. Sadat deployed the Egyptian army to the streets and fully reversed the price hikes within 24 hours. The episode entered the national memory as the Bread Intifada. It established an unbreakable rule of Egyptian politics. Under absolutely no circumstances do you touch the price of subsidized bread. Then, in June 2024, the government finally broke the rule. For the first time in over 4 decades, they raised the price of a loaf from 5 piastres to 20 piastres, a 300% hike. The streets stayed entirely quiet. The original price was so low that even after a 300% hike, 20 piastres is functionally free. The state also carefully ensured those 77 million people kept their ration cards. But navigating this political minefield was only the opening move of a much deeper financial reckoning. Look at this landscape. Egypt has 110 million mouths to feed, but only about 4% of its territory is arable land. Because they cannot grow enough food domestically, Egypt is structurally dependent on imported grain. They are the world's largest wheat importer, bringing in roughly 13 million tons annually just to survive. Russia and Ukraine historically serve as 2 of Egypt's largest wheat suppliers. When the 2022 invasion spiked global grain prices, Egypt's import bill exploded almost overnight. This chart shows how paralyzing that external shock was. Debt service obligations already devour 65% of total government expenditure. Add the historic fuel and food subsidies taking up another 25%, and you are left with almost nothing to run the actual country. The accounting sheet simply did not work. Facing total financial paralysis, the government desperately needed an outside bailout to stay afloat. That bailout came from the International Monetary Fund. And for years, the IMF has pressured Egypt to fix its internal finances with mathematical ruthlessness. The IMF's standard prescription is uncompromising. They require the state to float the local currency, eliminate widespread subsidies, and let the cost of basic goods reflect exactly what they cost to produce in the open market. By successfully raising the price of bread in 2024, President Sisi delivered a massive structural concession to those international lenders. He passed the test while keeping the millions of ration card holders pacified. To protect the poorest citizens from the shock of losing price controls, the state expanded direct cash transfer programs. However, the budget increases for these programs remain well below the level needed to track inflation. Real spending on social protection is falling. The bread system held together, but the IMF's mandate opened the floodgates. The government was suddenly committed to rolling out severe price hikes on nearly everything else. Over a 12-month period, fuel prices were hiked 4 separate times. By March 2026, electricity tariffs had jumped an average of 16% for high-consumption households and 20% for commercial users. Simultaneously, the government devalued the Egyptian pound to satisfy the international lenders. The combination of rising energy costs and a floating currency completely pulverized the purchasing power of the average citizen. This chart tracks the immediate fallout. The World Bank's official poverty figure sits at 33.5%, but recent estimates show poverty soaring under the weight of these reforms, dragging an estimated 40 to 45% of the country below the line. Floating a currency and raising prices only works if local wages rise to meet the new cost of living. In Egypt, real salaries actually declined against the post-2024 inflation surge. The strict economic medicine prescribed by the IMF is technically balancing the state's budget, but it is achieving that balance by suffocating the working class. The currency crash did create an economic recovery, but a very specific kind. The devaluation suddenly made Egypt a highly attractive destination for foreign manufacturers searching for rock-bottom operating costs. Turkish textile companies are flooding into the country, openly relocating their operations explicitly to take advantage of a labor pool that has become desperately cheap. Spreadsheet analysts view this influx of foreign manufacturing as a massive macroeconomic win, but it is a statistical victory built entirely on domestic financial suffering. If you want to see where Egyptian labor is actually building livable wealth, you have to look outside the country. The most explosive growth for Egyptian workers is happening in the construction booms of Riyadh, Doha, and Dubai. To solve the impossible math problem of the state budget, Egypt has engineered an economy where its most successful, profitable export is its own people, forcing them to leave home just to afford a life.
Quick pause. If any of this is landing for you, hit subscribe. We break down a different country every week. Now here's the twist nobody saw coming. The thing keeping Egypt's economy afloat right now isn't tourism. It isn't the canal. It's the Egyptians who left. Watch this.
7. The diaspora economy, how Egypt's best export became Egyptians.
Imagine you're a 28-year-old engineer in Cairo. You have a solid degree, you've worked at a local construction firm for 4 years, and right now you're sitting at your kitchen table, trying to make the math of your basic survival work. In early 2024, your salary was 12,000 Egyptian pounds a month. Before the government devalued the currency, that was roughly $400. After the devaluation, it dropped to $240. Meanwhile, your rent went up and the price of groceries doubled. Then comes the cultural breaking point. You want to get married, but your fiancé's family expects the shopka, the traditional dowry of gold jewelry. Because local gold prices track the US dollar, the cost of that gold has climbed straight out of reach. For Egypt's educated middle class, the math simply no longer clears. Basic milestones like independence and marriage have become mathematically impossible on a domestic salary. So you apply for a job in Riyadh that offer you 12,000 Saudi riyals a month. That's $3,200, 8 times what you were making in Cairo. You take the job and you send most of the money home. You are not an outlier. Today, there are approximately 14 million Egyptians living abroad, all making that exact same calculation. In 2025, remittances hit $41.5 billion, dwarfing revenues from the Suez Canal, tourism, and non-oil exports. Ranking Egypt's foreign currency sources, these remittances trail only behind total export revenues and foreign direct investment. Today, the Egyptian labor force working abroad generates more foreign currency than the nation's traditional exports of cotton, gas, or transit fees. Getting those billions into the formal banking system presented a significant logistical challenge. Before 2024, if a worker sent money through a formal bank, they lost up to half its value because the government was enforcing an artificial exchange rate. The diaspora bypassed the central bank entirely. They used suitcases of cash, smuggled gold, and informal hawala networks to get their earnings to their families without taking the government's haircut. In March 2024, the Egyptian government applied a brutal but effective fix. They floated the currency, letting the official rate crash to match the black market reality, and they pushed real interest rates sky high. This line graph illustrates the immediate result of that policy. After the March 2024 float, official remittances follow a vertical trajectory. By aligning the official rate with reality, the central bank captured $26.4 billion in just 9 months, an 83% surge. From a strictly monetary perspective, the reform worked. The government successfully hacked the black market, redirected the flow of dollars into the formal banking system, and restocked the central bank's reserves. But economists have a clinical term for what's actually happening here: brain drain. The Egyptian state spends 20 years paying for the public healthcare and education of its citizens, generating zero direct return on that investment. By the time these doctors, engineers, and project managers hit their peak productivity, they leave. Their skills are captured by foreign nations, driving the growth of Gulf gigaprojects and Saudi infrastructure instead of building up domestic industry in Egypt. The money they send back creates a macroeconomic distortion. The billions flowing into Egypt do not fund factories, tech startups, or productive commercial investments. The cash goes straight into household consumption, paying for rent, food, and weddings. This circular flow diagram demonstrates the resulting economic doom loop. The remittance cash buys imported consumer goods. That surge in imports widens the national trade deficit, and a wider trade deficit forces the country to desperately seek even more foreign dollars just to stay afloat. The $41 billion lifeline functions as an economic IV drip. It sustains the patient's immediate vitals, But the persistent trade deficit and lack of domestic investment mean the underlying condition remains untreated. There is a counterintuitive political consequence to exporting your educated middle class. Massive remittance flows actually reduce the domestic pressure for economic reform. Think back to the structural triggers of the 2011 revolution. That uprising was driven by young, educated, capable youth who could not find work and could not see a future in their own country. Today, those same frustrated, capable citizens have a highly visible alternative to taking to the streets. They have a one-way flight to the Gulf. By exporting its most dissatisfied and highly educated citizens, an authoritarian regime inadvertently creates a political pressure release valve. On a macroeconomic level, Egypt has built the equivalent of a recklessly undiversified financial portfolio. The country has traded self-reliance for an almost total dependence on foreign labor markets. A geographic asset like the Suez Canal, despite its vulnerabilities, is a permanent fixture. Foreign job markets offer no such stability. Egypt's dollar supply is now deeply exposed to external threats it cannot control. A global crash in oil prices, an escalation in regional conflict, or domestic labor policies like Saudiization that legally displace foreign workers would decimate Egypt's cash flow. The nation's economic survival is entirely concentrated within the labor demands of a handful of neighboring oil-dependent monarchies. Which brings us back to our 28-year-old engineer. He solved his own crisis by packing his bags.
8. The gas crisis from exporter to importer in 3 years flat.
In the summer of 2018, Prime Minister Mustafa Madbouli went on television with a major announcement. Egypt, he declared, had officially achieved natural gas self-sufficiency. The engine behind this success was the Zohr field. Discovered by Italian energy giant Eni in 2015, it was the Mediterranean's largest gas discovery. The Egyptian government began pitching Cairo as the Eastern Mediterranean gas hub, a global nerve center for liquid natural gas exports. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, European pipelines went dark, creating a massive energy vacuum. Egypt stepped directly into that void, sending 80% of its LNG exports straight to European markets to replace Russian supply. For about 18 months, Egypt secured a generational economic windfall. They had the supply, they had the infrastructure, and a desperate global market willing to pay. Today, Egypt is one of the largest LNG importers in the Middle East. This chart shows the vanishing surplus. In 2022, Egypt exported 7 million metric tons more LNG than it imported. By 2025, that flipped into a 6.6 million metric ton deficit. Projections for 2026 suggest Egypt needs 160 imported LNG cargoes to keep the lights on. The official government narrative attributes this sudden crisis to bad luck, but the data suggests a sequence of technical setbacks and human decisions made this energy reversal almost inevitable. The first layer of the crisis occurred thousands of feet underwater. The Zohr field, the primary driver of Egypt's self-sufficiency, started producing significantly less gas, and at a much faster rate than anticipated. The issue is water infiltration. Over time, salt water infiltrated the deep subterranean reservoir. As the water rushed into the porous rock, it physically displaced the natural gas and ruined the underground pressure needed to extract it. The statistical damage is severe. Driven largely by the Zohr decline, Egypt's total national gas production dropped from 6 billion cubic feet per day in 2022 to under 4 billion by 2025. That is a one-third reduction in national output in just 3 years. While subterranean water infiltration is a geological misfortune, it only became a national crisis because of the financial mismanagement happening at the surface. This brings us to a mundane administrative detail. Egypt simply stopped paying its bills. The government accumulated billions of dollars in unpaid invoices to international energy partners like Eni and BP for gas they had already delivered. When you stop paying your suppliers stop investing. Faced with unpaid invoices, international oil companies moved their exploration budgets to countries that paid on schedule. The Egyptian government recently paid down over $1 billion of those arrears, but the damage was already done. The long-term project pipeline for new wells looks essentially bare. Reversing an offshore production decline requires years of sustained investment. By failing to pay its financial debts, Egypt physically compromised its future energy security. Meanwhile, Egypt's population expands by roughly 1.6 to 2 million people every single year. That relentless growth drives up domestic demand for air conditioning, electricity, and fertilizer production. Every new citizen adds to the baseline amount of gas the country must consume, rather than export. Even if production had stayed flat, the math of population growth would have eventually swallowed the surplus. The supply failures just accelerated the timeline, turning an eventual shortfall into an immediate crisis. The financial irony is this: Egypt spent $4.9 billion of its scarce foreign currency buying the exact resource it was supposed to be exporting. Much of that gas is coming from the Leviathan field offshore Israel. To keep the lights on, an Egyptian firm signed a $35 billion deal to lock in future imports via the Arish-Ashkelon pipeline. The risk of this reliance became clear in June 2025. A brief Israel-Iran conflict forced a shutdown of those Israeli rigs. The pipeline stopped flowing for 6 days, and it took weeks for the supply to recover. Egypt has traded energy independence for a structural reliance on its neighbors. Their energy security is now tied to the strategic stability of the most volatile region on the planet and promises of $15 billion in new gas investments. Many of the technical issues are solvable if the capital keeps flowing, but the dream of becoming a gas hub has likely passed. European buyers who needed an alternative to Russia in 2022 have already signed long-term deals with the United States and Qatar. Egypt possesses the Suez Canal and infrastructure to connect Europe to the Middle East. Yet almost every one of these advantages has become a vulnerability. The gas failure is one dimension of a wider economic fragility, joining a collapsing currency and reliance on foreign debt to keep the state functioning. Behind every one of these multi-billion-dollar failures is the sheer scale of Egypt's population growth. To see how that pressure is reshaping the nation's future, we have to look at what Cairo is doing with its last $35 billion.
Okay, stop. Take a breath. Everything we've covered so far, the debt, the gas, the canal, the capital city, those are the current problems. Solvable, in theory. But underneath all of it is a much bigger clock ticking. One that no IMF program can pause. Let me explain.
9. The demographic clock, 110 million people and counting.
Every 12 months, the equivalent of the entire city of Phoenix, Arizona, materializes inside Egypt's borders. That's roughly 2 million new citizens added to the count every single year. This graph shows the sheer scale of that trajectory. Starting from a baseline of roughly 110 million people today, the curve climbs aggressively toward an estimated 160 million by the year 2050. In demographic terms, a massive youth generation entering the workforce is highly prized. East Asian economies like China and South Korea rode this exact wave, a demographic dividend to rapid economic expansion. But millions of young hands are only raw potential. To turn that human energy into actual wealth, a country needs a highly functional economic machine capable of putting them to productive work. If you look at the macro numbers, the corporate pitch for Egypt seems highly persuasive. Tourism is booming, bringing 15.8 million visitors into the country in 2024 alone. Foreign direct investment is flowing. Turkish textile companies are actively setting up shop, eager to take advantage of low post-devaluation labor costs. Consultants frequently package these details into a compelling thesis. Combine cheap labor, strategic geography, and a massive domestic market, and you have the obvious successor to China for global manufacturing. There is a flaw in that pitch. A demographic dividend only pays out if 3 specific conditions hold. Your youth must be employable, the economy must be able to absorb them, and domestic savings must be channeled into productive investment. Egypt is failing at all 3. The first failure is employability. The headline unemployment rate hovers around 7.3%, a figure that paints a picture of a stable, healthy labor market. This chart reveals a discrepancy. Isolating Egyptians aged 15 to 24, unemployment spikes 3 to 4 times the national average. The gender breakdown exposes a deeper flaw. Female labor force participation is among the world's lowest, stripping away 85% of working-age women. Treating a population of 110 million as an automatic economic asset ignores the math. Cultural and structural barriers keep nearly half of working-age adults completely absent from the formal workforce. The second failure is absorption. The domestic non-oil private sector has been trapped in a contraction for most of the past 5 years, meaning companies simply aren't hiring new graduates at scale. This bottleneck forces the country's most valuable talent, the doctors, software engineers, and accountants, to fly out of Cairo airport on one-way tickets. They are draining out of the domestic market and taking their high productivity skills straight to booming Gulf economies like Riyadh and Dubai. The final failure is savings. High inflation and compressed wages leave households with little extra capital, and what money is saved gets dumped into real estate or bold instead of job-creating businesses. With no robust private sector and no productive investment to fund one, the millions of young people face a stark choice: grind it out in gig labor or leave the country entirely. This steady line represents Egypt's 1.7% population growth, dangerously close to the optimistic 2 to 3% GDP growth. The slightest external shock, a regional conflict or currency wobble, sends GDP plunging below the population line, wiping out a year of progress. The scarce wealth that is generated is heavily concentrated. Right now, the top 10% of Egyptians control roughly 2/3 of the nation's total wealth. The entire economy is sprinting on a treadmill, running at maximum capacity just to maintain its current position, while 2 million more citizens are added to the bottom of the pyramid every 12 months. Beyond the financial math, there is an absolute physical limit. Egypt relies entirely on the Nile River for roughly 97% of its fresh water supply. That fragile supply is actively shrinking. Ethiopia's massive Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam is operating upstream, measurably reducing the flow of water into Egypt. Per capita water availability has already fallen below the United Nations poverty threshold. You can restructure debt, but no economic policy can magically generate drinking water for an additional 50 million citizens in a drying climate. Official government development plans largely ignore these geographic limits, opting instead to repackage standard IMF-backed reform agendas that fail to address the deepest structural flaws. A young, rapidly expanding population generates incredible momentum. But if you strap that powerful engine to a broken framework, operating under strict geographic limits, it stops acting like a dividend and starts ticking like a countdown.
10. The $35 billion question: is any of this actually working?
4 distinct IMF programs, 4 currency devaluations, a steep cliff in Suez Canal revenues, and a new $58 billion desert capital city rising from the sand. At the center of all this economic friction is a rapidly growing population of 110 million people trying to navigate daily life. Looking at these interventions over the last decade poses a serious question. Is Egypt's economic model actually working, or has the country simply mastered the art of delaying the consequences of it not working? The sheer volume of international capital pouring in makes the Egyptian economy impossible to ignore. The honest answer is both, simultaneously, and the outcome depends on which trend wins. Let's start with the genuinely positive evidence. GDP growth in the first half of fiscal year 2025-2026 hits 5.3%. That is the strongest showing in years, backed by a real rise in private investment. Inflation, which peaked over 35% in 2023, dropped to roughly 11.9% by early 2026. The government floated the currency, which wiped out the black market premium that had been distorting the price of basic goods. Tax revenues are up 29% year-on-year. Finance officials report the debt-to-GDP ratio, a measure comparing what a country owes to what it produces, has declined, bucking the trend in most emerging markets. But this macroeconomic victory comes with a major caveat. To get these numbers, Egypt required a 4th distinct IMF program. The data proves the Egyptian government is highly capable of negotiating bailouts and managing acute short-term crises. They know how to survive. But survival and actual economic growth require 2 entirely different skill sets. Economists describe this as having high macroeconomic stabilization capacity, the ability to put out financial fires, but almost zero structural transformation capacity, which is the ability to fix the underlying machinery of the economy. You can see this cycle clearly in this flowchart mapping the last decade. Back in 2016, Egypt hit a crisis, secured an IMF bailout, and bought 3 years of sustained stability and growth. Then the 2022 crisis hit. To achieve that exact same temporary stability, this new loop required 4 times the amount of IMF money, plus a $35 billion Gulf bailout and a far more dramatic devaluation of the currency. The math reveals a bleak trajectory. Every time Egypt goes through this cycle, the period of stability is shorter and the financial hole it leaves behind is deeper. The country is on a treadmill of progressively larger interventions, producing progressively shorter periods of stability. To understand why the bailouts lose their effectiveness, we have to look at this breakdown of the national budget. A staggering 65% of the entire budget is consumed by debt service, just paying the interest and principal on what the country already owes. Beneath that debt, there is the military's quiet expansion into the civilian economy. Their sprawling commercial empire crowds out private businesses, ignoring repeated requests from the IMF to retreat. Then there is the state's obsession with vanity megaprojects. These half-built concrete monuments absorb domestic capital much faster than they generate any productive economic growth. Finally, there is the demographic reality. The country adds 2 million new citizens every single year, placing immense pressure on a geography with a shrinking, heavily constrained water supply. None of these four issues are short-term liquidity problems. Because they are deeply embedded structural realities, they are completely immune to short-term financial patches. If current trends hold, the 2024 reform package and incoming foreign investments have likely bought Egypt between 3 and 7 years of macroeconomic peace. But that peace is highly fragile. The IMF has already had to revise its 2026 and 2027 growth forecasts downward due to ongoing geopolitical conflicts across the Middle East. Without a serious reduction in the military's economic footprint and a halt to off-budget debt accumulation, the math dictates Egypt will eventually require a fifth IMF program. The celebrated financial stability you see in today's headlines is essentially just the waiting room for the next predictably larger crisis. It is tempting to compare Egypt to failed economies like Argentina or Venezuela, but those comparisons miss the unique reality of the Egyptian state. Egypt holds massive strategic assets. Eventually, normal global shipping will resume, and Suez Canal traffic will return. Tourism will continue to grow. More importantly, the Gulf states will keep writing bailout checks to secure their regional interests, while the United States will keep providing roughly $1.3 billion in annual military aid to maintain its strategic foothold. In the brutal arithmetic of global geopolitics, Egypt is simply too big to fail. The international community has calculated that keeping the regime afloat is cheaper than dealing with the fallout of a collapse, so the funding will continue. But keeping a patient alive on a permanent IV drip of international cash only prevents them from dying. It guarantees the underlying disease will never actually be cured.
11. Final thoughts. What Egypt tells us. There's a temptation, when telling stories like this, to land on a tidy moral. Egypt resists that. The story is genuinely mixed. The reform program is genuinely working in some places and genuinely not in others. The Sisi government has genuinely stabilized a country that was sliding toward a balance of payments crisis, and it has also genuinely entrenched the structural problems that will produce the next one. What Egypt does illustrate, more cleanly than almost any other country, is a particular kind of economic trap that's worth taking seriously. Call it the strategic country trap. When a country is too geopolitically important to be allowed to collapse, the discipline that markets and creditors normally impose on bad economic policy gets short-circuited. Bailouts arrive, strategic deposits get parked at the central bank, mega projects get built that wouldn't pencil out anywhere else. The political class learns that it can extract one more emergency package, one more Gulf check, one more strategic aid disbursement, and it adjusts its incentives accordingly. The country doesn't collapse, but it also never fully reforms. Lebanon walked this exact path until it ran out of friends. Argentina has walked it for 70 years. Pakistan walks it now. Egypt is walking it expertly. The lesson, if you want one, isn't that strategic importance is bad. It's that strategic importance is a kind of curse if it removes the consequences that force structural reform. Free money, and MEF programs at concessional rates paired with $35 billion Peninsula sales are functionally a form of free money, is the most expensive thing a country can receive because of what it lets you avoid changing. For ordinary Egyptians, the consequences of this dance are not abstract. 1 in 3 lives below the poverty line by World Bank measures, possibly 4 in 10 by some domestic estimates. Real wages, denominated in dollars, are below where they were 2 years ago. The most ambitious slice of the population is leaving. The bread costs more, the electricity costs more, the fuel costs more. The new capital is shiny and largely unaffordable to the people whose taxes are paying for it. And yet, and this is the genuinely complicated part, the economy is, by some measures, the healthiest it's been in years. The crisis has receded. The reform medicine, where it's been taken, has worked. There's a coherent path to a country that grows out of its constraints, one slow decade at a time. Whether Egypt actually walks that path depends on choices that haven't been made yet. The pyramids have been there for 4,500 years. The Egyptian state has, in various forms, been a recognizable polity for longer than almost any other. This particular economic moment, the IMF programs, the devaluation, the mega-projects, the gas crisis, will, in the very long run, be a footnote. The question is what gets built on the other side of it. If you found this useful, hit the like button, it genuinely helps the channel, and hit subscribe if you want more deep economic breakdowns of countries most channels won't touch. Drop a comment below telling us which economy you want explained next. We read every suggestion. If you want more from this series, check out our breakdowns of Mexico's nearshoring boom, the Czech economic paradox, and the strategic importance of copper over the next 20 years, all in our playlist. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one.